get your notebook. There's more.
Welcome to the premiere edition of CN Live. From Alexandria, Virginia, just outside Washington, I'm Joe Lauria, Editor-in-Chief of Consortium News.
In Fayetteville, Arkansas, I'm Elizabeth Voss.
Elizabeth and I were co-hosts of the vigils for imprisoned WikiLeaks publisher Julian Assange. CN Live's format will be different. We'll be looking at Assange's case, but we'll also air segments on other news of the week. On today's show, we will be discussing the Jeffrey Epstein case, the race for the White House, and candidate Senator Mike Gravel will be with us. We'll talk about the state of the Middle East, reflections on Russiagate with journalist Aaron Maté, and we'll examine Assange's situation with Nils Melzer, the UN Special Rapporteur on Torture, who will be joining us from Geneva. But first, the headlines.
Financier Jeffrey Epstein remains in jail in New York as his lawyers try to arrange for his release on $77 million in bail, chump change for a billionaire like Epstein. He had cut a sweetheart deal with the Florida DA back in 2005 and had remained free until last week when he was charged with sex trafficking of minors. The prosecutor in that case was Alexander Acosta, Trump's labor secretary, until this morning when he resigned over the Epstein case. There are many questions raised by these developments. Why was Epstein suddenly arrested after all of this time? Did he have connections to intelligence agencies? What does this have to do with Donald Trump? We'll speak with international law professor Francis Boyle about these questions and more after the headlines.
The Democratic primary debates have begun and the race for the White House is on, now 479 days before the November 3, 2020 election. We'll be speaking later in the program with legal scholar Marjorie Cohn, who has recently written a piece examining Senator Kamala Harris's record as a prosecutor, and by former U.S. Senator Mike Gravel, a candidate for the Democratic nomination, about the Democratic field and the party's chances of dislodging Donald Trump from power.
WikiLeaks publisher Julian Assange continues to languish in a maximum security prison in London on a 50-week sentence for skipping bail, presumably trying to prepare for his defense under trying conditions for an extradition hearing in next February. We will be joined later in the program by Nils Melzer, the UN Special Rapporteur on Torture, who visited Assange in Belmarsh prison in May.
Russia has intensified its airstrikes against jihadist positions in Syria's Idlib province, the last major stronghold of violent opposition to Syrian President Bashar al-Assad. Meanwhile, tensions remain high between Iran and the United States and its Gulf Arab allies, weeks after Donald Trump came within minutes of setting off a potentially catastrophic war in the Gulf. The Emir of Qatar left Washington yesterday after a 4-day visit and apparently was unable to convince the U.S. to allow Qatar to act as a mediator between the U.S. and Iran. We'll be discussing this and other regional issues later in the program with Asad Abul Khalil, a professor of political science at California State University.
Lastly, former Russiagate special counsel Robert Mueller may not be testifying to Congress after all, when his July 17 appointment to publicly testify was put off indefinitely today. We'll be joined in the program by journalist Aaron Maté to discuss all things Russiagate.
Let's now turn to the case of billionaire finance Jeffrey Epstein, who was arrested last week in New York on charges of sex trafficking with minors. We're now joined from Champaign, Illinois, by Francis Boyle, a professor of international law, and we're going to get his insights into the political implications, including international, of the Epstein case. Welcome, Francis, to CN Live. How are you?
Thanks for having me on, and congratulations on your new initiative here for Consortium. That's great.
Well, I thank you, Francis. That's kind of you. I want to start you off by asking you, why was Epstein's case all of a sudden revived? It was sitting around in the Southern District of New York for more than a decade.
Right, Joe. I think this goes back a long time ago when you and I both agreed that it was the strategy of the Hillary Clinton campaign and the Democratic Party and their related news media sources to use Russiagate against Trump. And that started right after he was inaugurated. And you and I agreed on that. And I want to make it clear, I'm a political independent. In fact, I didn't vote for Clinton and I didn't vote for Trump. It was asking me to choose between cholera and the plague. So I picked the third candidate. But you and I, we try to deal with these things objectively as a journalist, and me as a law professional lawyer, and we concluded that was the case with this whole Russiagate matter, which Consortium has been the cutting edge on all of that. So okay, now we get to the Mueller report, and Mueller has always been a legal hatchet man for the deep state. I won't go through it here, but all these legal pundits on the mainstream news media praising Mueller. I mean, this is just a joke. These people were just establishment wannabes and bootlickers, and I won't mention the names here. But it was clear to me that when Mueller was put in there, this whole thing was going to be directed against Trump. And again, I'm not trying to defend Trump here at all. I'm just trying to look at this objectively. So finally, to make a long story short, as you know, we get the Mueller report. And, the first volume, which I have read, I'm about halfway through the second volume, said, no conspiracy. And put aside collusion, the technical term of art is conspiracy, which is pretty easy to prove between you and me. No conspiracy between President Trump, the Trump campaign, or anyone in it with Russia, which had been, our conclusion all along. However, volume 2, basically Mueller tees up President Trump to be impeached by the U.S. House of Representatives for obstruction of justice. And I haven't gotten through, I've gotten through about, I had the end of the academic year here, so I couldn't get through the whole Mueller report, but I've read the executive summary and this, that, and the other thing. And it seems pretty clear Mueller teed up Trump to be impeached by the House, just as Ken Starr teed up President Clinton to be impeached for fellatio and lying about a fellatio, which he was. And as you know, he was acquitted in the Senate. But I read the whole Ken Starr report. I was giving a lot of interviews on it. And, I didn't support President Clinton either. I didn't vote for him. But, it was just a pornographic hit job on Clinton by Ken Starr, Kavanaugh, and a lot of these Federalist Society lawyers tied into the right wing of the Republican Party. And remember, Starr went from one thing or another to finally get Clinton, and he got him on Monica Lewinsky. So, okay. Well, that's pretty much now what's happened with Mueller, with the Mueller report, that they couldn't get him on so-called collusion or conspiracy, that, Trump is a Manchurian candidate for the Russians. I've seen no evidence of that, Joe. And as I told you before, I spent 10 years studying everything about Russia and the Soviet Union at the University of Harvard, University of Chicago and Harvard, culminating in passing my Harvard PhD oral general exams in both Russian history and Soviet politics, which qualified me to teach those subjects to Harvard undergrads. I did not see that evidence. And in our many discussions, you didn't see it either. And we agreed on that right from the get-go. But now they've teed him up for obstruction. Well, it's pretty easy to get anyone for obstruction of justice. I was originally hired here to teach criminal law. I've taught that in other areas of criminal law. And reading through the Mueller report, it seemed to me that Mueller and the mainstream news media and the rest were trying to provoke Trump into taking steps that they could argue legally would constitute obstruction of justice. And that's my reading of what on here. They had a pretty good fix on Trump's personality, that he wasn't going to take the advice of his lawyers. He was going to fight back on Twitter and in the news media. And so they put together a case here on obstruction. And now Mueller was supposed to testify next week, but now that's been postponed for another week. And I think, you can disagree with me, but I think it appears that the obstruction charge by Mueller made out in that report simply is not going to get the House to impeach Trump over it. All the opinion polls show that, the American people are not at this point prepared to impeach Trump.
Nor is Pelosi, by the way.
Pardon me?
Nor is Pelosi.
Well, she made that very clear, and she is Speaker of the House, and she controls the agenda there.
Right.
That's correct. So,
so what are we left with, Francis? No collusion, no obstruction, because there was no underlying crime for him to obstruct. There's no collusion. So what are we left with, Francis?
All of a sudden, out of nowhere comes Epstein in the Southern District of New York that is now gunning for Trump. Now that Mueller has shut down indictments, we know that he has forwarded for prosecution different cases to the Southern District of New York. So again, not to exonerate, Epstein is guilty of sin. So, okay. And maybe Trump did or did not. I really don't know. I guess we're going to find out. But I think this is now the third stage here, to use Epstein and to see if this scandal can produce documentary evidence, not just words and testimony, which Trump will say they're lying.
Now, of course, Epstein was charged with sex trafficking with minors. He had been given a sweetheart deal in Florida about 10 years ago, and that was given by the then prosecutor Alexander Acosta, who was Trump's labor secretary until this morning. He announced his resignation because of the pressure on the Epstein deal. Now, tell us, Francis, what exactly Acosta had said, according to an article by Vicky Ward in the Daily Beast.
Right. Well, let me back up here. I had followed those proceedings in Florida in the news media and elsewhere simply because Dershowitz and I have been adversaries ever since I entered Harvard Law School in 1971, vociferously supporting the Palestinians and criticizing Israel for what they've done. So Dersh and I go way back, and I had followed those proceedings. And when Epstein brought Dersh in there, and he also brought Ken Starr, but that indicated to me a couple things. First, Dershowitz has been the legal hatchet man here in the United States for the Israeli government since Gene Rostow died. Rostow of the infamous Rostow brothers, who gave us the Vietnam War. And I had locked horns with Rostow a generation ago. So their guy here, their go-to legal guy here in the United States is Dershowitz. And it did seem to me then he was involved in there because somehow Israel was tied up into the whole thing. Second, we know for a fact, thanks to my colleague, Professor Ali Khan at Washburn Law School, Dershowitz admitted he is on the Mossad committee that approves the assassination of Palestinians, which is a war crime because they're protected.
Excuse me, Francis, let me just explain. Alan Dershowitz is been linked to Jeffrey Epstein as being perhaps one of his guests on his island where the alleged statutory rape against minors took place.
That is correct. And there's a whole subsidiary body of litigation related to the allegations against Dershowitz that he sexually abused girls on Orgy Island. And there's now one, I guess
Well, that was alleged. That's just been alleged. But just in the interest of time, You have said that Dershowitz is small potatoes, and that's not who they're going after here. They're going after Trump.
That's correct.
So,
I think they're going after Trump.
and that means they may try to get a plea deal with Epstein, who's now in prison, his lawyers have asked for a bail of $77 million, which is chump change for a billionaire like Epstein. So they might be working, you think, the prosecutors on Epstein to get a plea deal. He'll be getting a softer sentence if he can give up the goods on Donald Trump, which could be the way to get him impeached, because most Americans would not object to that. That would be the real first evidence of a crime, and it would be hard for anyone to oppose the impeachment of a president who was found guilty or of raping minors. Isn't that right?
I think that's right, Joe. And then second, you also have to look at the additional timing that Trump was about to attack Iran on completely bogus grounds of the shooting down of the drone, and he pulled back at the last minute. Okay. Thank heavens he did, because otherwise we'd be at war with Iran today, declaration of war, forget it. And I think this is part of a neocon plan here, deep state plan, to put pressure on Trump to the next time go along with hostilities against Iran. And that is being prepared now by Bolton, a diehard neocon going back to Reagan, and Pompeo. He was behind me at Harvard Law School, diehard Federalist Society guy, Koch brothers or whatever. So this could be a way, in addition, to put pressure on Trump to attack Iran.
Otherwise, they will reveal what Epstein tells them about him.
That is correct. And all the reports are that Epstein had his mansion wired for video and sound, and the Lolita Express wired for video sound, and his orgy island wired for video and sound. So I really don't know if there's evidence that Trump did this or he didn't. But if there is evidence that Trump did sexually abuse a girl, a minor, that would be the end of Trump, unless he went along with a war against Iran, and then everything would disappear down the memory hole. I mean, if Trump starts a war with Iran, no one's going to care anymore about Epstein or Dershowitz.
That's right. That's right.
Or I regret to report these poor girls or whatever. It will all disappear immediately, and all the coverage will be the war, rally around the president, etc. So right now, as of today, Joe, I try to be cautious based on the evidence I've seen so far. That's my take on it. But things could change. You and I stay in touch.
So Daily Beast writer Vicky Ward reports that Alexander Costa, who was until this morning the labor secretary and who was the prosecutor in Florida, cut that sweetheart deal with Epstein, that she reports, quote, that Acosta cut the non-prosecution deal with one of Epstein's attorneys because he had been told to back off, the lawyer that is, that Epstein was above his pay grade. And this is supposedly a quote from Acosta. I was told Epstein, quote, belonged to intelligence and to leave it alone. This is what apparently Epstein told his interviewers when he was being interviewed for the job in the Trump transition team. What does this tell you, Francis, about Epstein, if indeed he has intelligence ties, that he was setting up a blackmail operation with all these high-profile people, including Bill Clinton and Prince Andrew, have been linked to these trips to that island?
It was clear the only way that sweetheart deal could have been concluded that way was that the fix was in from high up on Epstein. Now, Acosta said, well, he's being worn down by Dershowitz and Starr. Well, that's a joke. He was a United States attorney, and he represented the United States government. He's got about 30,000 lawyers behind him, and a lot of them are a lot better than Dershowitz and Starr between you and me. So it just seemed to me that the fix was in there in Florida on behalf of Epstein, and that Epstein is either Mossad or CIA. we've now found out that Epstein started teaching at the Dalton School. That Bill Barr, Bill Barr, our Attorney General, he's CIA. Once CIA, always CIA. Never forget that when you're dealing with Barr. And his father was headmaster at the Dalton School, and he worked for the OSS. Anderson Cooper went to the Dalton School. Anderson Cooper is CIA. So we know then that Epstein, and this is reported in the New York Times, he started his career teaching at the Dalton School. He was teaching math, and he didn't have a college degree. Well, how can you do that? There's state licensing requirements to teach math that you at least have to have a BS or something like that. And I could not imagine a prestigious school like Dalton hiring someone to teach math without a college degree. So again, I don't know if that's true or not, but it could be that Epstein is both CIA and Mossad at the same time. We have a law professor here on my faculty who has publicly bragged that he works for both the CIA and Mossad. So that, that could be the case with Epstein. I don't know, but the where there's smoke, there's fire, and we've seen Mossad, we've seen CIA connections, and so get all his money.
So Barr was going to recuse himself from this case because he'd apparently worked for an old law firm that had represented Epstein at one time. But in fact, I think you're arguing that he should recuse himself because his father, Barr's father, who was OSS, got Epstein this job at a swanky Dalton private school as a math teacher, and he didn't even have a college degree. So Epstein's connection to an former OSS official goes back many years now. And you're concluding that intelligence relationship continued and that Epstein may have, in fact, been running a blackmail operation to suck in high-powered people like Clinton and Prince Andrew and Donald Trump.
Right. These days, with all due respect, I don't think anyone cares about Prince Andrew or Clinton except for, mainstream news media titillation. I think the objective here is Trump, and that's why all this erupted just recently on Iran, his refusal to go to war against Iran. And now it's clear that the Mueller circus isn't going to go anywhere whenever they call him now. It's going to be 2 weeks from now. That's not going to do the job. So I think that's what we're looking at right now. Right, Joe?
Now, Elizabeth, if you have a question.
Absolutely. Yeah, I wanted to ask if you think that the fact that this narrative has been promoted by the Clinton-tied outlet, the Daily Beast, and obviously lots of other essentially DNC-friendly corporate news outlets, do you think that makes it less likely that Clinton will actually come out and run for president, or do you think that this narrative being pushed by DNC-friendly outlets essentially rules that out completely? Because a lot of people are speculating that she may come in late into the race potentially.
Well, it'd be hard at this point with Bill Clinton. It sort of neatly knocks Bill Clinton out of the box, that's for sure. But, it seems to me Joe Biden is the anointed successor here to Obama and Clinton by the DNC. And right now, we're getting the Clinton campaign version 2.0 with Joe. And Joe Lauria, as you know, wrote a nice book there on Clinton, why I lost the election. So I'm afraid that, if the Democrats keep going the way they're going, the same thing's going to happen to Joe. But I think you're right. This sort of knocks Clinton out of the box for good. Right.
Interesting.
Well, it's a good point. Right.
Yeah. Joe, you're muted. But I think it's really fascinating that the Clinton, friendly outlets are pushing this. I think it's very Machiavellian, though, as you say, that young girls and their abuse and suffering is being used in this way as a token political move. It's really quite disgusting.
Well, Elizabeth, let me tell you, I was the lawyer, the attorney of record for the Republic of Bosnia and Herzegovina at the International Court of Justice, where I argued the case that the mass rape of the Bosnian women was genocide. At that time, there was 25,000 raped women in Bosnia. And they were all my clients, all of them. And I was responsible for each and every one of them, no matter what their age or how young. I've met with many of them. And I did get 2 temporary restraining orders on their behalf from the World Court. And I did argue this issue. So yes, you're right. And it appears that these young girls are simply being used as tools, as props by everyone involved here. But some of their lawyers, I think, are sincerely representing them and trying to obtain justice. But they're being used as part of a much bigger plot, I think, here against Trump.
What would it take to prosecute Trump? Would it be enough for 1 or 2 or more of these young women to come forward and name him? Would you need more than that?
Well, Joe, again, I don't wish to get into a lot of legal technicalities, but this all came up back with Archie Cox and Jaworski on indicting President Nixon. And at that time, Jaworski commissioned his staff lawyers to do a very long memorandum on whether or not a sitting president can be indicted. And I did read that memorandum because I was trying to get President Bush Jr. indicted. But the Jaworski conclusion of his memo and his lawyers was that a sitting president can only be indicted for murder. However, Trump could always be listed as an unindicted co-conspirator to sex trafficking by Epstein and others. That's what happened to Nixon. So Jaworski decided he couldn't indict Nixon for burglary and witness tampering and bribery and whatever, but he did list Nixon as an unindicted co-conspirator to a conspiracy to obstruct justice. And that was a grievous blow to Nixon. So right now, that is what the Southern District of New York could do if they have evidence against Trump. But again, Trump will just deny it, as he has all these other sexual abuse cases by women, many of whom, sound pretty credible to me, but okay, he's denied it. It's basically he said, she said. So they're going to need more, I think, than that. But that could be done, Joe. Yes, they could, even following the, and then, they're now Justice Department regulations on this, which Mueller cited in his report. But even that, there's nothing to prevent the Southern District of New York to list Trump as an unindicted co-conspirator to sex trafficking.
And that could lead to his impeachment, not only by the House, but his conviction in the Senate. And if he were convicted and removed, then he could be obviously charged, right?
For sure, yeah.
And that's what they're going to dangle in front of him. If they have enough evidence from 1 or 2 of these girls that Trump, and there's been a lot of stuff coming out. First of all, Trump said, I think in 2015 in a New York Magazine article that he knew Jeffrey Epstein very well, and that he was a good guy, and that it has been said that he almost likes beautiful women as much as I do, and some of them are on the younger side. Now, the other day, he said he hadn't spoken to him in 15 years. He had a falling out with him. He's not a fan. So, I mean, nobody's buying this stuff. So if they get him, they can come to him and say, if you don't do what we say, maybe start a war with Iran this time. Don't back out like you did the last time. We're going to go forward with this case. And we think that now, finally, we got you for something, because collusion was a dead letter from the start. Obstruction of justice doesn't work if there's no crime, but we got you on a real crime here, and the American people are going to be behind this.
I think the American, if there is hard evidence here, I think the American people, and even the Republicans in Congress would turn on him just like they did on Nixon. Sure.
Is the testimony of one or two girls enough hard evidence?
You're going to need witnesses.
Yeah.
And
And there were witnesses, weren't there, at these parties? They weren't alone.
Ghislaine Maxwell, she apparently supervised all this. And remember, her father, Maxwell, was Mossad. And for whatever reason, they offed him.
The British publisher of newspapers, yeah.
And they offed him there off his yacht.
Yeah.
So,
well, he fell off the yacht. We don't really know how that happened, but it's a good speculation.
We can make assumptions, yeah.
Of what happened there. We could disagree. But, it seems to me if they had Epstein and Maxwell together with these young girls who are now women, that might do it, right?
And Epstein's been protected all this time, you're arguing, because he had this role, this intelligence role, to gather this dirt on people.
Or CIA or both. And I would say Mossad or CIA or both, just like the law professor we have here in this faculty is publicly admitted he works for both Mossad and CIA. So
Now
they're not exclusive.
You've mentioned the Bernie Madoff case in relation to this. What connection do you see here? Or is it just an illustration of how this works?
Well, people are free to disagree with me, but I think, Madoff was sort of a money manager for Mossad. And that's why he quietly went off to prison without putting on a defense, that if he said anything, they would off him. So he just took his punishment. He's still alive there in prison. But, others, you're free to disagree with me if you want. But I mean, this gets into the question, where did Epstein get his money? Because if you look at the latest reports today, he said he was a hedge fund manager. There's a report right there today saying, well, we never did business with Epstein. We don't know where he got his money.
Who's saying that? Who is saying they never did business with him?
This morning on the wire services, I got on the computer before I head off. I had a doctor's appointment. I came back. It's here in my, it's either the New Yorker or New York Magazine or something like that, where some hedge funds people saying, well, we never did business with Epstein. So where did he get his money?
He did pretty good for a guy without a college degree.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's extraordinary, no college degree. And of course, now he's implicated Harvard all up and down. I think that's great. You have pictures today of Alan Dershowitz and Larry Summers bootlicking Epstein for money. And he's given Harvard, he promised them $30 million. He's given them $6.5 million. Harvard is, since certainly the days I was there, is pretty much a Zionist institution. So it'll be very interesting to see how Harvard responds. Indeed, some of us believe that Dershowitz took an early retirement because Harvard forced him out. They knew the mayor was going to hit the fan, and they wanted to distance themselves from Dershowitz. So that's why he no longer teaches there. He just spends all his time running around TV shows, giving interviews, and bootlicking Trump. And another friend of mine who's had long experience with Dershowitz, he's bootlicking Trump because he wants to get a pardon arising out of Epstein. I don't know.
Francis, we're coming to the end of this segment. We have a question from one of our viewers. Someone on Facebook asks, what are your thoughts on the motives of Likud accusing Barack and Olmert of links to Epstein? I don't know anything if that's true or not, but that's a question from Facebook. Do you know about that? That Olmert and Barack were connected to Epstein, the former prime ministers of Israel.
If they've said Barack, then obviously he just announced he was going to run for prime minister. So connected with Epstein, that's it. He's dead.
Yeah, the way Trump might be. Francis, thank you very much for joining us from Champaign, Illinois, to discuss this very interesting case that's way more than just a horrible incident of alleged sex trafficking of children.
Right.
And we are now going to go on to our next guest. So again, Francis, thanks for joining us.
Well, again, Joe, and congratulations on your new endeavor here for Consortium. And I wish you the best of luck.
Well, we're just getting off the ground and we're getting the kinks out. So hopefully we'll carry on and we'll have you on again sometime.
At
Thank you,
least my
Francis.
Zoom worked this time. So thank you.
Okay. All the
Thanks.
best.
Yeah.
We're going to turn now to the U.S. presidential elections. We have here in the United States the longest political season of just about any country that says it has a democracy. I think it's only a 6-week period before a British election. But here we have over 400 days to go in the run up to this election. We go through this long primary process, of course, and it has begun with the first debates just a few weeks ago. We're now joined by Marjorie Cohn from somewhere in California. Where are you, Marjorie?
I'm in San Diego.
San Diego, California. Thank you very much for joining us. We were introducing you as the author. Of course, you are a professor emerita at Thomas Jefferson University, is that correct? And the former president of the National Lawyers Guild. And you have written a piece recently that first appeared in Truth Out, and that was republished by us on Consortium News, entitled Kamala Harris's Distinguished Career of Serving Injustice. And I want to talk to you about that, and thank you for joining us on this premiere edition of CN Live. Kamala seemed to be waffling a bit on the busing issue after her confrontation with Joe Biden in that first debate.
Yes, she planned this very theatrical confrontation with Joe Biden, where she called him out on his refusal to support federally mandated busing back in the day, leaving the impression that, in fact, she supported federally mandated busing. And the next day, she backed off from that and said, well, it's just one tool in the toolbox. So she actually really gained a lot of support, gained many points in the polls for doing that, left him with egg on his face. And in fact, turns out that she has exactly the same position he does on busing, which is that it should not be federally mandated. It's one tool among many for desegregation.
Has she suffered any consequences for that?
There's been something in the media about it. I think there have been some articles. Some of the talking heads have mentioned it. I don't know that her poll numbers have then fallen because of that. I think that she's probably got more positives out of it than negatives.
That's interesting. Elizabeth.
Yeah, no, it's really disappointing to see candidates get that much publicity on what appears to be a stance, only to quietly sort of walk it back the next day. But I did read your piece on Truth Out, and that was republished, as Joe mentioned, on Consortium News. It really was amazing to read about all of these other instances of what it looks like really corrupt and egregious behavior by somebody who then presents herself as a progressive prosecutor. There were instances that you mentioned in your article that I had never heard about, even following things relatively closely. Can you tell the audience a little bit about some of the items of corruption that you discussed in your article?
Well, I'll tell you very briefly a list of things, positions she's taken, actions she's taken that are much less than progressive, and then talk about 2 cases that are particularly egregious, where she supported outrageous prosecutorial misconduct. She refused DNA testing for Kevin Cooper, very likely innocent death row inmate. She opposed state regulation or requiring that police wear body-worn cameras. She favored criminalizing truancy for kids, raising cash bail fees, keeping prisoners locked up because they provide cheap labor. She favored arresting undocumented, she favored turning over to ICE arrested juveniles who were undocumented. She covered for corrupt police lab technicians. She blocked gender confirmation surgery for a transgender prisoner, and the federal court found that denying that surgery to that transgender person constituted cruel and unusual punishment under the 8th Amendment. She opposed legislation when she was the Attorney General of California that would have required that the Attorney General independently investigate police shootings that resulted in death. And she refused to prosecute Steve Mnuchin for the foreclosure scandal, where some 80,000 people lost their homes in an illegal pattern, and he gave her a $2,000 contribution to her campaign shortly thereafter. Her own Attorney General's Consumer Protection Bureau was saying you should file some kind of lawsuit against this practice, but she didn't do it. Now, back to the egregious prosecutorial misconduct. In Orange County in California, for years, perhaps decades, there has been an illegal program of collaboration between the Orange County Sheriff's Department and the Orange County District Attorney, where they plant informants in the jails and put them close to inmates who already are represented by counsel, and have them extract statements from these inmates and then try to use them in court. That violates the Sixth Amendment. And this was such really a scandal that a federal judge, lower court judge, held 2 hearings over a 6-month period with 39 witnesses, and found that many of the prosecutors and police officers had lied, and in fact recused the district attorney from further participation in a death penalty case. Recusing means that the DA is no longer going to be prosecuting the death penalty phase of the trial. It would be the Attorney General who takes over the prosecution. That was Kamala Harris. She opposed the recusal and tried to smooth over what the district attorneys had done, basically covering for them, so much so that the appellate court called her out on that. There was another case in California as well, where the prosecutor fabricated a confession and then gave it to the defense attorney in discovery, knowing that the defense attorney was talking to the defendant about a possible plea bargain. And so in reliance on this confession that he didn't know was false, the defense attorney went to the client to try to persuade the client to plead guilty. And of course, that undermined trust between the lawyer and the client. And the court found that this was egregious, that it shocked the conscience, and reversed the conviction. And Kamala Harris, the Attorney General, was arguing that the shock the conscience standard is only met when there's physical brutality. In other words, other egregious misconduct would not shock the conscience and result in a dismissal. And so right down the line, and there are a few exceptions where she's taken more so-called progressive positions, but the overwhelming thrust of Kamala Harris's prosecutorial record as a district attorney for many years and later Attorney General of California has been nothing like progressive.
We're speaking with legal scholar Marjorie Cohn from San Diego about the Democratic primary process, and specifically about Senator Kamala Harris, who is a candidate for the Democratic nomination. She's presenting herself as a progressive. There doesn't seem to be any doubt that the Bernie Sanders insurgency of 2016 has moved a lot of these candidates to try to at least position themselves as progressive, and muddying the understanding of what that really means. Do you think, Marge, that there is any hope for someone who is more truly progressive, someone like Tulsi Gabbard, Elizabeth Warren, or Bernie Sanders? Or do you think that the Democratic National Committee, the established Democrats, will try to sabotage their campaigns and the media, with the compliance, of course, with the media?
Well, there is a struggle going on within the Democratic Party, where Nancy Pelosi, in an interview with Maureen Dowd, was disparaging some of the new younger progressive congresswomen, Ilhan Omar, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, Ayanna Pressley, Rashida Tlaib, and she is tacking much more to the center, agreed with Mitch McConnell on a bill that did not do anything to protect migrants at the border. And we have an emergency going on now at the border. So there is this struggle within the Democratic Party. Now, if you watch the two Democratic primary debates, you would see that Bernie Sanders' fingerprints were all over the topics in the debates, and his campaign, and it's not just a campaign, it's really a movement that he built since he ran against Hillary Clinton in the primary in 2016. His movement, which has continued, has really affected and influenced the other Democratic candidates. And so we have Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren, but interestingly, although there are a lot of similarities, there are some real differences between their positions. Now, Bernie Sanders calls himself a democratic socialist. He's not really a socialist. He's more like a New Deal Democrat in the tradition of FDR. But you have the positions of universal health care, student loan forgiveness, free public college, taxing the rich, green energy, climate change, et cetera, which were all featured in the two debates. Now, in terms of Sanders versus Warren, Sanders appeals to lower income, less educated people. Warren appeals more to postgraduate, people with postgraduate degrees. Sanders performs better with men, Warren with women. Younger people are much more likely to vote for Sanders, seniors much more likely to vote for Warren. But there is tremendous overlap in their positions. And I think that Bernie's positions have really gained traction with many, many people in this country, particularly young people who have not been particularly enthusiastic about elections in the past, who are working for him, who are out there putting forth his ideas. So I think there is real room. And of course, Tulsi Gabbard is very good on non-intervention issues, although she's not against military intervention. She's just against so many military interventions, but she is progressive on that issue. So I think that there is real room in the cards here for a progressive Democrat to get the nomination and ultimately to beat Donald Trump, of course, which is the primary consideration. Although people who say, don't criticize any of the Democratic candidates, don't dirty them because we just need to beat Trump. This is the period of time during the next several months where we distinguish between the candidates, where we decide, where we look at their policy position and their politics and their records, and we determine who would make the best president, who is the best person to beat Donald Trump. And I think that's the frame of mind that we have to have in the next period of time.
Do you think only a progressive could beat Trump, or could Biden actually defeat Trump, or even Harris?
Okay, those are different questions. Do I think only a progressive can beat Trump? No, I don't. Do I think Biden could beat Trump? No, I don't. Because Biden has only really been on the public stage recently in the debate and in a few interviews and a few talks, a few speeches. Biden has a tendency, and this goes way, way back, aside from his politics, which are very centrist, very moderate, not progressive in the least, but he has a tendency to put his foot in his mouth every time he opens his mouth. He is not articulate. He does not think things through before he speaks. And as he gets older, I'm saying this as someone who is also getting older and realizing that we get less articulate as we get older. And I think Biden is showing that. So I'm not sure one-on-one. I'm not saying that Trump is so articulate, but Trump has that reality show persona, which has gotten him to where he is. Against all conventional wisdom, but I think that he would walk all over Joe Biden. In terms of Kamala Harris, could she beat Trump? I don't know. I don't have a crystal ball. There are people who would not vote for her because she's a woman, not vote for her because she's Black. But I think that her record will hurt her because of the things that I said. Now, could she hold her own on a debate stage with Trump? I think she could. I don't think she'd take any guff from him. For example, the way that he was hovering behind Hillary Clinton at that debate in during the 2016 election. So I think it's early. I think that these polls, every day there's different polls and the media's all over this one's higher, that one's lower. They're kind of meaningless really at this point because the election is so far away. So I think it's really our job to look at the candidates, distinguish between them, and support the most progressive candidate or candidates to ultimately get the nomination and run against Trump in the election.
Elizabeth.
Yeah, so building on that point, a lot of people have speculated that one of the reasons that the DNC has been flooded by primary contenders is to spoil the race for Bernie Sanders. Do you think that it's basically a strong likelihood that that will happen and we'll see somebody like Kamala Harris become the nominee? And if that does happen, you know, will her record that you've discussed in your article actually see the light of day from other news outlets, from major corporate outlets, or do you think it's effectively going to be basically put under the rug?
That's a good question. I mean, obviously, the DNC undercut Bernie Sanders' candidacy and you know, paved the way for Hillary Clinton's nomination, which I think was one of the biggest political disasters of our time. But in terms of Kamala Harris, if she does get the nomination, I think that the corporate media will be thrilled. You know, that she's photogenic and they've already been very enamored with her. It's going to be, I'm afraid, up to us in the alternative media to really put her record on trial. And I do think that I don't know that Trump, if she did get the nomination, I don't know that Trump would challenge her on any of these issues because he is not progressive in any way, shape, or form. But I do think we're going to have to fight to get her record before the public if she is to get the nomination. And of course, it's a long ways away. There are many people who are not happy with what she did with Joe Biden. I mean, and again, I say don't pay attention to the polls. She did rise in the polls right after that. But I think there was a bad taste in people's mouths. Forget the prosecutorial record. When people are calling it a cheap shot. That, you know, that was obviously rehearsed, very dramatic. I was that girl who was bussed, making it look like she was very progressive on the issue of busing, and Joe Biden was not, and it was really a charade.
Marjorie, the Democratic National Committee changed the rules about the nomination process that the only on the second ballot. I'm losing the name of these special people that they choose who get a vote, whether they're a delegate or not. But only on the second ballot that those people can come in and vote, and not on the first. So there's been speculation that that's one reason they also put so many candidates out there, that they would have to go to a second ballot, and then these people would get that vote. Why can't I remember the name of that of those people I'm talking about? The special delegates.
Superdelegates?
Superdelegates. Superdelegates.
Yeah, I thought they were doing away with the superdelegates, but I haven't heard what you're
No, they are allowed to vote on the second ballot at the nominating convention, not on the first. So if there were so many candidates out there, they could split the vote and none of them would get a sufficient number to win the nomination. Then it'd have to go to the second ballot. And guess what? The superdelegates would step in and choose the establishment candidate. Have you not heard that?
I hadn't heard that, and that's very disturbing. I think that there is, from what you say, there is a possibility that could happen, and that would be quite disturbing.
So when you talked about the different groups that support Warren and Sanders, old for one, young for other, women for Warren, men for Sanders, sounds like that would make a pretty nice ticket.
Yes, it would make an excellent ticket. In fact, that would be my dream ticket would be Sanders Warren. I think it's a winning ticket. Because they do appeal to different constituencies. People tend to lump them together because they're both so progressive, especially on economic issues, but not just economic issues. That would be a dream ticket. Yes.
Do they get along personally? Do you know?
I think they do. Yes, I think they do. Everything I've seen is that there is good chemistry between them.
And Bernie would have the presidency and Warren the vice president.
Well, either way, I would be. I would support the ticket either way. Of course, I have to say right now, and I think this is really, really important for people to understand. We have to fight like hell to get the most progressive candidate to win the Democratic nomination. But once that primary is over, once the primaries are over, and once that candidate is chosen, our number one goal needs to be to get rid of Donald Trump. Donald Trump has, and I don't want to say he's been a one-man wrecking ball, because he's had his prostitutes. He's had his Attorney General, William Barr. He's had Mitch McConnell, who has done his bidding in spades and in a very dangerous way. The Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, although he did hand Trump a defeat in the census case, which was a big victory for the people. I think we need to celebrate our victories. They're few and far between. And Trump has endangered the world so much. I mean, I understand that he and I think when he does things that are positive, we have to admit that and celebrate that. For example, negotiating. Of course, he's created a lot of hassle in the first place, but negotiating with Kim Jong-un in North Korea is a good thing, not a bad thing. When he walks into North Korea from the demilitarized zone, I think we need to celebrate that. That's good. It's not formal diplomacy, but it's a first step. I think when he tries to tamp down, I don't know that he's doing it so much now, but tamp down tensions with Russia, where the two leading nuclear armed countries in the world are the US and Russia, is a good thing, not a bad thing. But regardless, I think that overall, what he has done in this country, the way he has really made people's lives so much more miserable, and particularly immigrants. Now, certainly Obama did his share of deportations. He did not have a progressive immigration policy by any means. But I don't think that he separated, I know that he did not separate parents from their children across the board the way that Trump has done, and lock these children up in what really amounts to concentration camps. And the list goes on and on. So I do think we need to pick the best, most progressive candidate, and then we need to support the Democratic nominee. And we all need to get on that bandwagon and defeat Trump. I think it's really critical.
Interesting you say that, because given the class interests of very rich and powerful Democrats, do you think that they would prefer Trump to be reelected than Sanders or Warren? That they might endanger their own class interests?
I think there are some certainly that fall in that category, but I think by and large, and of course, again, this is anecdotal and based upon my opinion only, I think that most Democrats, the overwhelming majority of Democrats, really want to get rid of Trump. Now, that said, when Bernie Sanders did not get the nomination, my understanding and my memory is that 10% of Bernie voters voted for Trump, which I think is incredibly disturbing, but also says a lot about what a terrible candidate Hillary Clinton was. Any Democrat should have been able to beat Trump in a heartbeat. And the fact that I know millennials just hated her, did not trust her. That was a strategic and tragic error on the part of strategy on the part of the DNC to edge Bernie out in favor of Hillary Clinton and to actually allow her to become the nominee.
Elizabeth?
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, myself, I did not vote for Donald Trump. I voted for Jill Stein, but I can say very much that as a former Sanders supporter during 2016, it was difficult, if not impossible, to fathom voting for Hillary. And it really, as I believe Julian Assange called it, he said basically it was like a choice between cholera and gonorrhea. I mean, it was really not something where any of us felt happy trying to go to the polls in 2016. So I really do hope that we don't have that type of situation again. And I'm afraid, especially after reading your article, that if Harris is the nominee, that's basically the situation we'll be facing again on a lot of different fronts and facets of her policy.
I'm afraid that's true. My children are millennials, and they were dyed-in-the-wool Bernie supporters, still love Bernie, love Elizabeth Warren, and detest Kamala Harris, don't trust her. In fact, one of my sons encouraged me to write this article and sent me research for it, and was very pleased when I wrote it. And he's a millennial. So I don't know if he would vote for Kamala Harris. I would if she were the nominee. Just don't know.
I agree. I think that is a really sobering assessment, that we're at that point politically where the DNC would rather field a neoliberal who has less of a chance to win than actually go with its base, which so enthusiastically supported Sanders. And I think that crisis of identity in the Democratic Party has just really not been solved. It was put on hold by Russiagate. It was not really looked at. And I think that that's one of the most dangerous things that we're watching the DNC face now as we go into the primary process and the election in 2020. Do you think that there will be a resolution to that during this process, or is it just going to be put on hold again?
I don't think they can avoid it. I mean, because of the contradiction that's coming out now between Pelosi and these young progressive women in the House, it's erupting into the open. Now, one thing that we need to keep in mind is that the Democrats did extremely well in the 2018 midterms, and that was in spite of the cheating, the voter suppression, etc. But many of the progressives won in safe districts, did not take seats away from people who were not progressive. So I don't think that we can rest on the victory of 2018, but I think that we should be encouraged that it is possible. And we're not just talking about the presidency here, because the Democrat could win the presidency. The Democrats could hold on to the House and still not take back the Senate. It's very, very closely divided. There are just a few seats. I think the Democrats have to take back 4 seats to take back the Senate, and taking back the Senate is critical. Getting rid of Mitch McConnell, who is setting the agenda for legislation about war and peace for the Supreme Court, for any number of things, for immigration. He is one of the most dangerous men in the country, and indeed in the world. And I would put him right up there with Donald Trump. So I think it's critical that we not just focus on the presidential election, but focus also on keeping the House in Democratic hands. And the House has done some very progressive things since the Democrats took over in 2018, and taking back the Senate.
Marjorie, we're bringing in Mike Gravel, Senator Mike Gravel. We need to go to a musical break. Could you stay with us? I'd like you to hear what Mike has to say and then to join in the discussion.
I can stay for a few minutes.
Okay. If you can't, we'll say goodbye to you now. But if you pop up again, that would be great.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
We're back live on CN Live, and we're joined now by Senator Mike Gravel, former U.S. Senator Gravel, who is a Democratic candidate for the nomination, as he was back in 2008. Mike, welcome to CN Live.
Good. Glad to be aboard.
Yes.
This is a very historic day for me.
Tell us about it.
Well, what's happening is that we're probably close to 1,000 votes shy from getting into the debates, and the kids that are running the campaign are absolutely ecstatic, and so it seems that we'll get the number of 65,000. Now, the question is will the DNC let me in? Because I think they're adding the fact that you have to be in 3 polls. Now, we've been first in a number of polls, but only one that's recognized by the DNC. So we'll see what happens. The kids have hired an attorney to represent our interest.
Wow. Oh, so they got deep pockets too. So the new rules that the DNC put in place is that in order to get in a debate, a candidate must get 65,000 donors from, I think, 20 different states or 22 different states.
Yeah, we met that a long time ago.
You got the states, and now you're saying you have 64,000 donors. You're 1,000 short.
Yep, and the deadline is Monday evening.
So you got this weekend to get 1,000 more people to donate at least $1.
Yep.
And then you will be eligible for the debates, but you're saying they still might not let you in because they already have 20, right?
That's right. They got 20, and I don't mind. They can make it 21. I'll sit on the side there, and all they got to do is give me 6 minutes. That's all I got back in 2008, so I can handle 6 minutes pretty well. I know what I'm going to say, so hell.
Why don't you give us your 6 minute?
6 minutes is the biggest threat to our survival on the planet right now is nuclear. And what's going on is that under Obama, the Congress authorized $1.7 trillion to refurbish our nuclear arsenal. Now, if you know anything about the way the Pentagon works, there'll be cost overruns. So we're essentially talking about $3 to $4 trillion to turn around and refurbish our nuclear arsenal, which of course is against the law because we signed the treaty, the non-proliferation treaty, and there's a section there that says that we have to continue making an effort to decrease the nukes down to 0. And so we're going in the opposite direction. But what's really interesting is this has become the top priority of the Pentagon because it means establishing the nukes for the Army, silos, nukes for the Air Force and cruise missiles, and then nukes for the submarines. So it's not only just the explosive bombs, we're talking about the delivery systems. So this is a refurbishment of the entire defense posture of the country. And so that's why it's more realistic to look upon this as $3 to $4 trillion. Now, here's the kicker of it all. If any one of the 9 nations were to unload its nukes, not half of them, could be a quarter of them, those 200 nukes, 100 nukes, it would trigger a nuclear winter. And that means you'd eclipse the sun for a decade or more from heating the earth, which means we would all die a very miserable death. That's what the Pentagon is determined is their top priority. And so when you just reason it out, that here $3 to $4 trillion is being used for weapons that can't be used. Anybody that uses them is going to trigger a nuclear winter. So we're spending this kind of money, and you don't have to worry about retaliation. Hell, one person unloads it, you don't have to retaliate. We're all going to die with the nuclear winter. So that's the message I would like to get across and of course we're impotent as a Congress, representative government, to do anything about this. And that's what leads me to be able to make the case that we need to bring the people into the operation of government as legislators, lawmakers. Law is central to human governance. Law is central to civilization. And yet the law in the United States and in all the other representative governments, representatives have a monopoly on the law, and the people give this power of monopoly to legislators on election day when they vote. So people can't exercise the vote for making laws, but they can give that vote away to politicians. And the results of that is self-evident to anybody who follows public affairs.
Mike, that was only 5 minutes. So maybe they'll give you another.
I'll have a minute to spare when I get on the stage.
Yeah.
But thank you for measuring that, because I was going to try to test out my message.
It's 5 minutes, and you've got one of the most extensive platforms out there of anyone. So there's certainly many, many other things you can talk about. It's interesting that you point out nuclear weapons as being the primary danger, even over, of course, climate change, which will take years to have effect, where this could take seconds to take care of us. But Elizabeth, please weigh in on some questions for Mike.
Absolutely, Mike. I'm really glad to hear about your, anti-nuclear armament message, because it's something that is, as you say, so critically important to all of us, whether we're engaged politically or not. And yet it is also
nobody's talking about it in
right.
Canada.
Exactly. You made my point for me. Nobody's talking about it. So I'm very glad that you have brought that up here. And I do hope that you get those few hundred or thousand, additional donations so that you can make it onto the stage. Will you be addressing anyone in particular if you do make it to the debate?
No, I'd rather get the message across on the nuclear. A slight kudo to the corruption of the planet. And then, of course, the corruption of our system of financing. When they say that, well, we can't afford to have all of these things that Bernie Sanders is advocating, and I'm advocating all of them, and then some. And the truth be told, we could turn around and nationalize the Federal Reserve System, and then we could monetize all these projects just like we monetize everything for the banks. And then, of course, if you want to talk about the economic security for all human beings, that's not all that complicated. I'll try it out on you. That is that the profits of capital must pay for the cost of capital. Let me repeat that. The cost of capital must be paid for by the profits of capital. That's the reason why the rich get richer, because they turn around and they borrow money to acquire the capital. The capital pays itself off and returns the loans, and then at the end of the exercise, they're an increment wealthier. Now, what we could do is the same thing. We could turn around after we've nationalized the Federal Reserve and set up a national program for the people to be able to borrow money against a capital product. The product, or let's say the instrument of production, would then make a profit. The profit would be used to pay off the loan. And after the loan's paid off, the person who would then own the productive tool would enjoy an enrichment. Now, that's not all that complicated. And of course, you could do it. I'll give you an example. Here, we know that we need to have more windmills if we're going to get off of carbon fuels. Well, let's say that a windmill costs about $5 million. So what we would do is the government would put up a program, and you could raffle it off and make the choice by chance. But you could then do you could do 100 million people eventually. And so then the people would get to raffle and say, okay, I'm entitled to get a loan with 4 of the people of $5 million to build a windmill. We then send, as soon as it's constructed and it's all done with prearranged contractors approved, the design, all that. And so now what would happen is we sell the energy from the windmill to the utility company. The utility company would pay us. 2/3 of it would go to pay off the loan. And then when the loan is all paid off, we've made 5 millionaires. just like that. And all we got to do is lend them the money, and the money's secure because it's backed up by a purchase agreement of the energy that we produce. And we're trying to produce more energy so we can get off of the other stuff. So that, can you imagine what we could do? And when people have all these schemes that, oh, they're going to do this, going to do that. Here, all we got to do is provide the loan. We could take several $1 trillion to set up a program nationally to be able to loan money to individuals who would then do various things with it.
Absolutely. That brings me back to, another question about your, anti-nuclear stance. And that is that basically, I think a lot of us see Russiagate as a major reason that there has been such a move towards back towards this kind of nuclear increase in nuclear armament and that kind of thing. Do you attribute some of this to Russiagate? And is it odd to you that Russiagate is so much in the news and yet the nuclear side of it is not?
Not at all. In fact, the whole Russiagate, in my mind, is a bit of a hoax. We know from way back when Benny, who's on the same organization that I'm the senior member of, which is the VIPs, the
Veteran Intelligence Professionals for Sanity. Right.
I'm their oldest member, and so what they've shown is that there really wasn't a Russiagate, and this is the big mistake. Noam Chomsky just recently had a piece, a verbal interview, and he pointed out that the Democrats have all latched on to Russiagate. And for the last year, 2 years, it's Russiagate, this, Russia, when they really weren't going after the meat. And so now Mueller comes out with his report, and there's no big deal on Russiagate. This was a device to harm Russia or any relationship we would have with Russia. We do the same thing with China. I mean, who's going to attack us? China and Russia are not threats to us. China wants and China is represent less than 10% money that they spend on defense. So if there's such a threat to us, why don't they match us in the defense dollars? They don't, because they don't feel a threat. They have no desire to go to work. Now, the argument you hear about China is, of course, South China Sea. Well, let me explain that to you. The China Sea is the main avenue for the travel or the transportation of the entire economic substance of China. And so for them, it's the most important waterway in all of their economic existence. So what did they do? They picked a defensive device. They went to these islands. Some are in dispute, but they're letting the people fish. They're not doing any damage other than dredging and creating the island so they have a runway and some storage facilities. Essentially, what the Chinese have done in the South China Sea is to station a bunch of aircraft carriers that are stationary and can't be sunk. That's what these islands in the South China Sea. So they're being defensive right in their own backyard. Now, boy, and of course our military just runs up and down this China Sea, getting as close as possible to these and doing intelligence gathering on these various islands. You know, if China were doing that to us in the Gulf of Mexico, we'd go berserk. We'd attack them. Of course, we're the only country in the world that has first strike policy. No, the other 8 nuclear nations don't have what we have. And of course, our whole policy that I was talking about on the nuclear expansion is to strike fear and horror in the minds of the people who would attack us. And nobody's going to attack us. This is just the nuclear deal is the mother of all boondoggles.
Mike, before we let you go, we were just talking with Marjorie Cohn about the Democratic field. She had a terrific article that we republished in Consortium News about Kamala Harris. I just want to know if you can give me some of your views, positive and negative, about the other candidates particularly Warren and Sanders. And what do you think that would be a good ticket? And who are the worst ones?
Well, the best ticket. Well, the best ticket would be Bernie Sanders with Tulsi Gabbard. I think Tulsi Gabbard, at 38 years old, is a person that I've seen more gravitas than any other politician in my entire career. She has a natural demeanor that is just awesome. Now, I'm also very pro Elizabeth Warren because she has a very detailed plan. So I could live with Bernie and Warren, or Bernie and Tulsi, or Tulsi and Bernie, or whatever. There won't be two women on the ticket, but hopefully there'll be one lady on the ticket, and it would be either Warren or Tulsi. Now, the worst ones, in my mind, it would be Joe Biden, obviously, who's a Neanderthal ideologically. And the other is, this may surprise you, but I'm very concerned about Peter Buttigieg, the mayor, Mayor Pete, because he talks in generalities. You know, he's going to reach across the aisle. Well, there's nobody on the other side of the aisle. They all went over the hill as lemmings with Pied Piper Trump. So there's nobody to reach over to, and you're gonna try to cut a deal with Mitch McConnell. My God, he's the Grim Reaper, and he's proud of it. So what alerted me to Buttigieg is that the fact that, and it was reported to me, I haven't had a chance to ask him face mano a mano if that's what he said, but what's reported to me is that he had a concern about the fact that Obama commuted the sentence of Chelsea Manning. Well, I think that's horrible. He's been in the military. And so what she's done is shown the courage to look at the data that's crossing her desk and realize that it's different from the statements made by the higher ups. And so she exercises her courage as a 22-year-old corporal. Can you imagine? Now, Mayor Pete, you know, I think he was a captain. I don't understand how he got to be a captain. He's only got 6 months of service. So I don't know the details of that. But I do know that his thinking has got to be very, very pro the military-industrial complex. And what happens is that the only ones talking about the military-industrial complex of the large group, and I haven't investigated everybody, but clearly Tulsi Gabbard has had the courage because she comes from a military state. And so she has the courage to take Obama on over his policies and take on the military-industrial complex. That's courage in my mind. And so, you know, there's an old saying, what's the most important virtue you could have? Well, it's the virtue of courage, because that implements all the other virtues.
That's great. And I agree with you about what Mayor Pete said about Chelsea Manning. Mike, we're going to let you go, but I want to ask you to leave us with an anecdote or two about Joe Biden, who you served in the Senate with. So you must know a few things that you could tell our audience about that's not widely known.
Well, he sort of made the statement that, you know, he was sucking up to Eastland and Strom Thurmond and the others. I had the same motivation. I didn't want to suck up to these guys, but the motivation I had was that the Senate has a prayer breakfast, and all the senior members are there. So as a young freshman, I figured, and of course I'm not religious, but in fact I'm an atheist, but so I figured that what I'll do is I'll go to the prayer breakfast and rub shoulders with these guys, and they'll help me maybe down the road. So I go to the prayer breakfast. Now, I was already committed to oppose the Vietnam War, which was senseless. And so I go to the breakfast of all these senior members, and these are all the people that are supporting the Vietnam War. So there was an ounce of what I would consider Christian empathy in the whole carload. And so I understand Joe's motivation, but apparently he didn't withdraw it once he saw the fallacy of it. The other thing, too, is keep in mind that Joe was immediately, when I'm elected, he was on the Committee on Committees, which means he helped people, these senior members select other. And this is Robert Byrd that put him on as a concession. And unfortunately, that's when Joe had his wife was killed in an accident, his child. And so Joe was incommunicado, and because of that situation. And as a result of that, he was courted by a lot of people in the Senate, not only for the unfortunate situation, but the fact that he was on the Committee on Committees and had a vote as to what assignment you could get. Of course, I was being punished by Ted Kennedy for not supporting him for a whip. And I got the humble assignment of Public Works, and the illustrious Committee of the Buildings and Grounds, which permitted me to release the Pentagon Papers. So
yes,
there's justice in all of it.
You can read all about that in a book that Mike and I wrote called Political Odyssey, about Kennedy and about the Pentagon Papers. Of course, Mike, I wanted to thank you, but I have to tell you that now that you've announced you're an atheist, you're never going to win the presidency.
Does it surprise you? I didn't realize. It's not breaking my heart.
Yeah, it shouldn't surprise you that I'm signing off with a joke as well. So, Mike, thanks so much. We are now going to go to a interview we did earlier today with Nils Melzer, who is the UN Special Rapporteur on Torture, who visited WikiLeaks publisher Julian Assange in Belmarsh Prison in May. And Dr. Melzer was kind enough to spend about a half an hour with us, and we're going to run that interview right now. Joining us from Geneva is Professor Nils Melzer. Nils is a human rights, he holds the human rights chair at the Geneva Academy. He's a professor of international law at Glasgow University. And of course, he's the United Nations Special Rapporteur on Torture. And we thank you for joining us, Nils.
Thank you for having me.
I just want to, as a precursor, ask you to explain to the audience something I think is not widely understood, which is what is the role of a special rapporteur? There's about 37 of them. And I've covered UN headquarters for 25 years. I interacted with numerous rapporteurs. My understanding is that you're not paid by the UN, in other words, by the governments, the member states, but paid by your own university for your normal salary, and there might be other sources of income. And that's important, of course, because of the independence of the UN rapporteur. Can you explain just briefly what a rapporteur is, what he does, and how he's funded?
Yeah, right. Special rapporteurs are independent experts that are appointed by the United Nations Human Rights Council, so by the states, for a period of 3 years, which is renewable or extendable to 6 years. And we're not paid, so it's an honorary appointment. And so obviously we'll have to have a job on the side. Usually we're academics. But the mandate we have is to, in my case now is the topic of torture and other forms of ill treatment. And so I have to report as a rapporteur. I'm reporting back to the Human Rights Council and the General Assembly in New York as to the compliance of the UN member states with the prohibition of torture and ill treatment. And there's 3 ways in which I do that. I visit countries, usually 2 or 3 countries a year, to examine their prison systems and their laws and their practices. The second thing is I do individual interventions, diplomatic interventions on behalf of individual torture victims whose lawyers or family members or they themselves have contacted my office. And the third thing is that I submit thematic reports on topics like migration or corruption and how it relates to torture.
Now, the public generally likes to talk about the UN as a monolithic body, but of course it's made up of many, many agencies, and with the Secretariat, the General Assembly, Security Council, Economic and Social Council, etc. When you make a report, is it correct for people to say the UN has said this?
Not really. I think it's correct to say that it's the rapporteur that said that, who's an independent expert. So it's not binding for the UN what I say. Obviously, the mandate that I have received by the UN and by its member state is important. It gives me a certain level of authority, but it is an expert authority and not the United Nations as a full institution.
Right. Now, you must know of or know personally Richard Falk. Is that correct?
Actually, I don't.
Richard Falk was, of course, the special rapporteur on Palestine. And as you can imagine, he was very critical of the state of Israel and very much advocating for the Palestinians, and it incensed the United States and Israel, obviously. And they worked very hard to get his head. I recall standing at the stakeout in front of the Security Council, and Susan Rice, who was the U.S. ambassador at the time, openly called for his resignation. It was because he made a mistake, really. He gave him an opening by writing something about 9/11 on his blog that he questioned the official narrative of it. That was enough. They looked for something to get him. And Ban Ki-moon, put out a statement under pressure from the U.S. very easily. He said that this was unacceptable, but that it was up to the Human Rights Council to dispense with him. They did not. He left. He wasn't reappointed. So my question to you is, after what you've said about Julian Assange, and given the political and media climate that we are in about him after his indictment by the U.S. government under the Espionage Act, have you been pressured by any governments at all?
No, not so far. Not so far. Obviously, I don't know what's going to happen in the future, but I have been very outspoken. So far, I have not received any, pushback apart from simply the answer of the Foreign Secretary of the UK on Twitter, basically stating that I should not interfere with the UK judicial system, which was a bit surprising given that Mr. Hunt is my counterpart in the UK and actually invited me to, upon my request, invited me to visit Mr. Assange, and obviously also knew that, what my mandate was and that I might come up with some statements that might criticize the UK.
Well, speaking of visiting Julian Assange, do you plan to see him again? Are you trying? Because we know very little about his condition right now. It's gone dark after it was decided that the extradition hearing would begin next February. So are you planning to see him again?
No, I don't. It's actually an exception that I can go and visit individual prisoners, because obviously I'm mandated to cover 190, plus UN member states and all the victims of torture or potential victims of torture in these countries. So there's no way I could follow up on an individual, regularly and go and visit them in prison. I felt that this case is very important because it's so politicized. I felt that I cannot make a objective assessment without actually going and visiting him in prison.
Well, thank you, Elizabeth.
Yes, following up on Joe's question earlier, I was wondering, now that you've published your report, what, if any, further steps can be taken to act on your findings? Is there any place that this case goes within the UN? Is there any other steps that can be taken by the public that you would like to talk about? Or is this kind of the end of the road as far as what can be done from your end on this case?
No, my action really was to go and visit him, and then based on this visit, I drew my conclusions. We did this medical assessment, I did my legal assessment, and I communicated my concerns and my recommendations to the four involved states, the US, the UK, Sweden, and Ecuador. Now, these letters that I sent in the end of May, they will be published in the end of July, 60 days after they have been written. That's the standard procedure. And that's also the deadline for those states to actually respond in writing to the questions and the recommendations I made. Now, if I feel that these responses warrant, further action on my part, I can do that. I can write back to them and say, well, thank you for your answer, or, or I deplore that I didn't get an answer, and I would like to ask, these follow-up questions, so I can take this dialogue further. And all of this correspondence will obviously also be published with my next report to the Human Rights Council, and each individual communication will be published 60 days after it has been made.
Interesting. Thank you. What do you think it says that some human rights advocates have sort of doubled down on this rape narrative that you so much criticized in your report and afterwards. Do you think that it's a situation where there are a large number of people who perhaps are uninformed about the facts and have not given it a real solid, amount of their time to actually research what happened underneath what I believe you called a superficial narrative? Or is this sort of exactly what you were talking about in your report? Is it basically, the stenographers of the state doubling down on a favored lie? What's your perception on that?
Well, I think the general public is misinformed. Now, I don't think they're to blame because, there's so much in the world. You can't expect of every citizen of this world to actually research the facts on every single case that is being addressed or even not addressed by the press. I myself, as I have said publicly before, I have been misinformed about the case of Julian Assange because I had never dealt with it before. I've never met the man before. And only when I started looking into this case, I started realizing how much fabrication there was. Now, I don't think that this misinformation is a coincidence. I do think that there's too many factors where we see that the involved states have actually actively pushed a narrative that is a clear contradiction with the facts. But then the public takes this up, and I think one of my roles as a rapporteur is to report to the UN and to the states, but also to the public, and make them aware and encourage them to live, to basically look behind the surface or below the surface a little bit themselves. Because I can say that the information, the reality, the truth is very close, immediately under the surface. You don't have to dig very deep.
Now, you expressed in an earlier interview, Nils, the fear that Assange could actually die in prison. There was a video that was released, the video of Assange in prison. The video was taken before he became seriously ill and was taken to hospital. But it was released after he went into the hospital, creating a false impression that some media outlets fostered that he was okay. He was actually in hospital at the time the video came out, and he looked to even be smiling and standing around. Did you see that video, and what did you think about that?
Yeah, I've seen the video, and it does show the cell that I visited, where he was, the cell number 37, where he was actually being detained. And it shows, if I remember well, it shows that some inmates help him prepare the room for being painted. When I was visiting, it had just been painted. So that was before my visit that this video had been taken. When I visited him, I was able to have conversations with him. He was agitated, and he showed the symptoms that I described publicly of someone who had been exposed to psychological torture for a prolonged period of time. And also but I was able to converse with him. And I also think it's very important that we get a realistic picture. Someone who has been tortured does not necessarily sit in a corner the whole day and, just kind of shiver. And torture victims, especially psychological torture, is very perfidious. It aims at destroying your innermost self, your self-confidence, your sense of reality, and your emotional kind of and mental stability. But that does not mean you don't necessarily see that from the outside. That's why I took two experienced medical experts with me who were able to have worked with torture victims for decades. One a psychiatrist and the other one a forensic expert. And they're able to look at people and to run tests on them and medical protocols that are designed for that purpose. And they can distinguish symptoms that come from torture and ill treatment from other symptoms, because any prisoner is sometimes depressed because he's in prison. Anyone who's facing criminal prosecution has a certain amount of anxiety. That's not necessarily torture. So it's important to know that you don't necessarily see torture written on the face of a torture victim, just as you don't see child abuse written on a child's face in school. Just as you don't see necessarily, battered wife written on the face of a battered wife.
Assange was one of the most wanted men by the British and American establishments for what he has revealed particularly about the U.S., which are prima facie evidence of war crimes in Iraq and other corruption and many other governments. So now they've got him. They have him in prison, finally. Do you have any indication at all, any evidence, or from him or any other source, that he's already being interrogated or questioned without a lawyer being present? And if so, are you worried that at one point they may be finished with him in terms of what they can get out of him, his sources or whatever else they want to get from him, and that they wouldn't care one way or the other about his health?
Well, no, I have not. I have no indications that he's already being questioned. What I do know is that he's not being given sufficient access to his lawyers and sufficient access to legal documents to prepare a defense in his various proceedings against him. Not in the Swedish proceedings, which for now don't ask for an extradition anymore, but are still prosecuting, are still investigating rape allegations against him. He did not get sufficient time with his lawyer to discuss these allegations. The lawyer went to see him in prison. He had a 2-hour slot reserved for this visit, and Assange was brought to this meeting with 1 hour and 45 minutes delay. He only had 20 minutes to translate a 400-page Swedish language court document to Assange, which obviously is not sufficient, and he was not allowed to have these documents in English or in any language that he understands. So how should he prepare his defense? The same thing, you saw that he then participated in one of the extradition hearings a few weeks back through video link. And he was basically confronted with an outline or a summary of the US indictment, and he was asked to take position, but he had not received the actual indictment and been able to read through it and then actually understand what he's being charged of. So this is, really looks like a serious violation of his procedural rights.
Elizabeth.
Absolutely. That's extremely concerning. And I don't think that's really been talked about much in the media whatsoever. And neither has most of your report received some attention. But after that, it seems that, mainstream corporate media was very uninterested in what you had to say. I don't know if you have any comment on that or your perception of the mainstream media now versus before taking up this case.
Yes, unfortunately, I would say, if someone in my position, if you look back at the 20 years of my career, I've not been known to spread conspiracy theories. I've not been known to, be headline hunting at all. I have a background with the ICRC, confidentiality, 12 years. I've worked for the Swiss government, foreign affairs. I've had positions that required a very moderate and balanced and objective approach. This is the first case where I actually come out in my life, and as I said in my press release, this is the first time in 20 years that I see democratic states ganging up and isolating a single individual and systematically violating his fair trial guarantees, his human rights in every aspect, and arbitrary detention and even ill-treatment, mobbing that amounts to psychological torture cumulatively. That's very serious. And what surprises me is that beyond, it's not a matter of whether you like or don't like Assange. This is really not even about Assange. It's about these states and what they're doing. And how is it possible that the populations of the US, of the UK, of Sweden, and of Ecuador tolerate this type of mistreatment and misuse of judicial powers against a single individual? So to me, this is inherently newsworthy. It's something where the mainstream press, the so-called fourth power in the state, should jump on it and investigate it. And by all means, if I'm not right, let's expose it. But they should engage with me and test, these allegations that I make and these conclusions I draw very thoroughly, because if I am right, this is extremely serious, not only for Assange.
That is what I found so extraordinary about your report, at least the public report, when you use that term ganging up in reference to democratic states. Now, we talk about American exceptionalism, but I think it extends over to the UK as well. there is a sense that they are above international law, that it's for everyone else but not for them, and that the ICC, for example, the International Criminal Court, should never investigate anything that a Western white leader does. And there's been a huge problem, in my view, in the credibility of the ICC, but it extends here to this case as well. And you had the guts, frankly, to say that, to take them on like that. And I think that's why I asked you my earlier question, whether you've gotten any backlash from the governments, and you say they have it. I think I point to your Newsweek piece again because it was extraordinary. You quote extensively from the U.S. Declaration of Independence that when a people are no longer satisfied with their government, it was their duty, basically, to rise up against it. And the way I look at it now, we've reached a point like in the American people are living in a bubble, not only separated by two oceans, but by a whole faulty view of themselves and where America's role in the world is. Now, this is promulgated by government through media. So a guy like Assange could be seen as being against the interests of the United States when he is not against the interests of the American people whatsoever, but of the rulers of the United States. I wonder what you think of Leona Brinkema. She is the judge that he will most likely face if he's extradited to the U.S. She's known as the national security judge. She's in a courtroom just about a 5-minute drive from where I am in Alexandria, Virginia. I've been in her courtroom. You have said before, but I want to ask you again, does he stand any chance of getting anywhere near a fair trial, given the state secrets privilege that the U.S. has, in which evidence could be withheld from the court? Does he have any chance of a fair trial in the U.S.?
Not in my view. Not in my view. Not at all. I think that the public prejudice against Assange is monumental in the United States. He's being perceived as one of public enemies number one. He is being, obviously described as a public enemy, basically by the current Secretary of State and former CIA director. Obviously, other public figures have called for his assassination. There are whole videos on YouTube summarizing this that last, minutes and minutes. You have you have this environment, and then you send them to a court where, to my knowledge, no national security defendant has ever been acquitted. You send them to a court. I think it's the same court and the same judge, if I'm not mistaken, that has also been responsible for the trial against Chelsea Manning, where she has been sentenced to 35 years originally, which is draconian punishment. I agree that whistleblowing can be an offense under national law, especially if you have been entrusted with this information. But then, where are the prosecutions of these, as you say, prima facie war crimes? Where are the investigations and prosecutions of all the other crimes and corruption activities that have been exposed by this whistleblower and by WikiLeaks? Because when you, as I've said before, when you prosecute a whistleblower and a journalist for exposing war crimes and corruption, you have to be very careful, because if you don't prosecute the war crimes, then clearly you don't have equality before the law. There's no chance of having a fair trial. Clearly, then prosecution becomes persecution.
Absolutely. Following on from that, what do you think, in a worst case scenario where Assange is, convicted in the United States, we know that would have dire consequences for journalism, but what can you comment on the consequences that would have for human rights, not only in Assange's case specifically and for whistleblowers and publishers of whistleblower leaked material, but also in general in terms of silencing someone who, as you just said, has exposed these human rights abuses and evidence of war crimes?
Well, I wonder, could I be prosecuted for putting out information that I have observed about torture and ill treatment just because they're in the public or the national interest of a state? I think this is an absolutely emblematic case. It is really a precedent of an importance that cannot be overstated. We have extremely powerful institutions today with states. the division of power between the judiciary, the government, and the parliament very frequently doesn't work that well because people know each other, they help each other, they cover each other. They're all human beings, right? And so that's why the media, as the fourth power, is absolutely essential, that they actually hold power, governmental power to account. The judiciary also has to do that. If that no longer functions, and now we even start criminalizing exposure of abuse and crime and corruption, well, what this means is basically we're enforcing a system of impunity. And we know from neuroscience that unchecked power, once you have unchecked power, it crushes any human being. If you're not subject to some form of effective control, people lose control in how they abuse power. That's not because someone is a bad person. It's just because human beings are like that. That's neuroscience, right? So I think it's extremely important that we maintain an effective system of oversight, and journalism is absolutely crucial to that.
Perhaps it's not overstating it, but it won't be just Assange that could be put on trial, but the idea of a democracy itself, because this is a case that is, without exaggeration, historic, and in the sense that no journalist ever in the United States has been prosecuted for publishing classified information, and that is extremely worrying, obviously. But I wonder if you think that where the U.S. stands in terms of its democracy right now, and if he's put away for years, what would that mean about whether the U.S. is still a democracy?
Well, democracy means it's the rule of the people. If the people tolerate it consciously, then it's perhaps still a democracy. I don't know. But it's one that would allow impunity for massive abuse, impunity for war crimes, impunity for corruption. And I don't think that anyone in the US really wants that. A normal UN citizen wouldn't want that. I don't think it's for me to make an assessment of the state of American democracy, but I think I can see what are the risks arising from this case for American rule of law and American democracy. I have voiced that in various publications, and obviously, when I call on people to stand up and take responsibility, I don't mean that in terms of violence or uprising. What I mean is that they use their democratic rights that they have to hold those accountable that govern them. They're representatives in Congress. They're the ones that elect the president. That's the people. They have to take responsibility and make sure that government is held accountable, that they talk to the press, that they demand from the press to be informed, and empowered, and not just entertained.
Well, thank you, Nils Melzer, very, very much. We've been joined from Geneva by Nils Melzer. He's the UN Special Rapporteur on Torture, and we've been speaking about his report about WikiLeaks publisher Julian Assange. Thank you again for joining us.
Thank you very much for having me.
Well, I want to thank again Nils Melzer. That was quite an interesting interview he gave us. What did you take from that interview with Melzer that was interesting?
I think one of the most important things that I took away from that interview was that there was new information about the video that we saw coming out of Belmarsh prison from Julian Assange. The fact that he was commenting on the specific room that he interviewed Assange in, and the fact that he did believe that, that obviously it was taken before his interview due to the paint having been, put in. I thought that was interesting, and it was helpful because there was a lot of confusion around that video, and some people really did take it as if Assange had, not been as ill as Nils Melzer's report had indicated. And so, I was really glad to hear him comment on that.
George, are you with us from Budapest?
Yes, I am. Yes, I am.
Okay,
yes.
Welcome back. What did you take out of the interview by Melzer?
Well, as always, whenever he's speaking, he's extraordinarily powerful morally, powerful as a fine intellect, as a man of great understanding of international law, international affairs. And so anything he says always has a real resonance to it. And I was really struck by how pessimistic he seemed to be about the state of the West, because time and again he came back to the issue of, well, these are democracies we're talking about. Democracies mean rule of the people. And if the people tolerate these abuses, then there's ultimately we're in a very bad way, because it's up to the people and the people's representatives to express themselves in indignation about the war crimes that are perpetrated in their names, about the persecution of whistleblowers, and the impunity for war criminals. And if the people tolerate this, then things are very bad. Then it's quite clear that the people are tolerating this in the UK, they're tolerating it in Sweden, and they're tolerating it in the United States. I mean, all right, Ecuador is a special case, but these are three supposedly sophisticated Western democracies, and yet this is what we have, that those who perpetrated the war crimes walk around free, enjoying comfortable salaries, cushy gigs in think tanks, cushy gigs on Fox News or MSNBC. They don't pay any price. The only people who are punished are the whistleblowers, whether it's John Kiriakou, whether it's Chelsea Manning, and then of course Julian Assange. And if this goes on, then ultimately, what exactly are our democracies? What is this this political entity that we're living in that commits war crimes, wages wars, unprovoked wars against smaller, weaker states that have done nothing against these countries, and punishes those who criticize it? So it is a very bleak outlook that he described, and I was just very struck by this. I mean, he seemed more pessimistic than I've heard him before.
Absolutely. And not only do we have that, but we also have this media freedom event held in Britain with Jeremy Hunt attending, and
Yes.
Meanwhile RT is barred from entry, as well as the fact that Assange is imprisoned just down the road, a few miles from this event.
Yes, that's right. And he was really striking that that Hunt kind of arrogantly dismissed. There was you may have seen the little video clip of a Rutley reporter accosting Hunt and saying, "Hey, well, you've got this media freedom conference. How come there are no representatives of RT and Sputnik?" And he said, "Well, there's nothing to do with media freedom." So clearly, what this is about is not about media freedom. It's a propaganda exercise. It's a propaganda exercise of seizing upon the subject of media freedom and using it as a cudgel to bash states that are deemed adversaries of the UK and the United States, and of course Canada. It's a kind of a nice threesome. And so they're not really serious about this. I mean, it's just it's much like when Western states embrace the cause of human rights. I mean, they're not serious about human rights. I couldn't care less about human rights. But it's a useful weapon to deploy against those the West deems unacceptable, whether it's Assad or whether it's Iranian leaders, whether it's Russia, whether it's China. You pretend that you're suddenly really passionate about human rights. So in the same way, you suddenly declare that you're passionate about media freedom. The other thing that was interesting about this conference is that they weren't really talking about media freedom so much as cracking down on disinformation. And that's a very interesting thing, because it's, on the one hand, there's Hunt in his smarmy way, quoting John Stuart Mill, John Stuart Mill, blah, 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 blah. But John Stuart Mill would never dream of talking about disinformation. I mean, John Stuart Mill thought exactly all information is good. If you think something is wrong, you challenge it, you criticize it, and refute it. You don't ban it. You don't outlaw it and say, oh, this is a really terrible thing, there's disinformation. And that is exactly what these people like Hunt and Friedland are about. They want to just get rid of what they call disinformation. And that's in fact where things are moving generally in the Western political system, which is, well, let's ban all the things that we don't like. These are produced by Russian bots, the Russian government. This is disinformation. Then we've got the whole hate speech stuff. So let's get rid of all the stuff that hate speech. Let's get rid of all the extremist people. We don't want to listen to them either. So essentially, you're getting the situation in the name of media freedom. You're just simply wiping out entire swathes of opinion that you don't like, in the reports that you don't like. So there's YouTube purging its content. You got Facebook closing down account after account because, oh, these are media bots. They're really representatives of the Iranian government. Says Facebook. There's no evidence is presented that they are. They just, you don't like what they're saying. So in the day, it's a conference about media freedom, but what they're using is essentially a kind of how do we justify removing media freedom? What are all the ways in which we can find to eliminate all the voices from the media that we don't like? And this is why the mainstream media kind of has been very supportive generally of this conference, because in a sense, it's a way of let's sidelining the alternative media. Fine, we'll have the New York Times, the Guardian, Telegraph, Times. Oh, that's good. Those are the
Aaron
main.
Was there and he left. He's supposed to come on at 4:15.
Yeah. So but what we don't want are all the other voices, that have emerged on the media landscape in recent years. So there's a nice kind of a marriage between the sort of political establishment of Hunt, Friedland, and the august media, the sort of the New York Times, CNN, and so on. So yeah, let's get rid of all those unpleasant, unwholesome voices from the media.
Absolutely. We also saw the recent suspensions of many, Assange supporters from Twitter as well. So basically, right. I think, in my opinion, what we've been witnessing is a real purge of all WikiLeaks supporters, Assange supporters, and, basically anyone who expresses dissent against this prevailing mainstream narrative against Assange.
Mm-hmm. That's right. That's exactly right. And the only mention of Assange was there was one comment that Amal Clooney made. It was a very disingenuous comment. I mean, after all, he was her client, so she knows him very well. She knows exactly all that has been going on with Julian Assange. He was her client back in 2010 when the whole Sweden started making this whole extradition request. So she knows all about it, but yet pretends that somehow, well, out of the blue, the Americans just sort of issued this indictment. And this has been criticized by the New York Times and the Washington Post and the Guardian. So as if somehow, well, okay, don't criticize me. I'm just repeating what the New York Times and the Washington Post and the Guardian are saying. So yes, it's good that she brought up WikiLeaks, but what is she doing hanging around with Jeremy Hunt?
I can go on forever about Hunt and Friedland and her Ukrainian father and all that, but right. We're going to bring in Aaron Maté right now. Is Aaron with us? All right, that's all right.
No.
So I'm going to introduce Aaron. I think most people watching know who he is. He's really was and has been in the forefront of the journalists debunking the Russiagate story very early on with our founder, Robert Parry, and other writers at Consortium News, including your host here. We all withstood vicious and absurd attacks that we were Trump supporters or Kremlin agents, really new Cold War stuff, right? When we were, I think, speaking for myself anyway, and for Bob, really nonpartisan, we saw through this phony collusion story from the start. And perhaps we saw that the abuse of power by intelligence agencies was a greater long-term threat to the U.S. than maybe even 4 years of Donald Trump. So welcome, Aaron, for joining us on the premiere edition of CN Live. Really appreciate you being here.
Thanks for having me.
So I want to talk to you about the article that you published in Real Clear Investigations. Quite interesting. But first, today, as you know, there was news that Robert Mueller, special counsel, will not be testifying on July 17th. The way I saw it was it's indefinitely suspended. Why do you think that Mueller might be relieved that he doesn't have to testify?
Well, it's interesting. We can only speculate, right? But I think we have to note, first of all, that Robert Mueller made very clear he did not want to testify. And I think the reasons for that are obvious. He wrote a disingenuous report that, basically looked at every single instance where somebody in the Trump orbit interacted with somebody with a Russian passport or who claims to know somebody who has a Russian passport. And he spun that in the most damning way possible, while ultimately having to acknowledge that there was no conspiracy there and there never was one, as Bob Perry was flagging from the very beginning. And then his press conference was disingenuous for many reasons. He tried to suggest he would have charged Trump otherwise without saying he would. And then, of course, he had to backtrack on that when Barr made him issue a joint statement clarifying his remarks. And so basically, Mueller has been disingenuous, and we know that his report left out all the questionable things. It didn't look really at the role of the Steele dossier. It suggested that people were Russian agents without accusing them of being Russian agents, while leaving out countervailing information, like in the case of Konstantin Kilimnik, Manafort's business associate, that Kilimnik actually was a valued State Department informant. So, Mueller understandably did not want to face scrutiny for all these things. That's why I think he didn't want to come testify. And they had to subpoena him to get him to come appear. And so as to why now they've had to delay it for a week again, I mean, the official story is that they want Mueller to appear for longer, but they're working out the details. It's a bit murky. But, I mean, my speculation here is simply that Mueller is either trying to buy time to prepare for the inevitable questioning he'll face from the Republican members, or he's just trying to stall and buy more time in an effort to see if he can avoid testifying entirely. It's certainly going to be an interesting couple of weeks.
Yeah, for sure. Now, I bet like hell that he was trying to prove collusion, unless he never really believed it himself. I don't know, obviously, but he just couldn't. So he's not let go of the idea. He floated the obstruction of justice idea, which is not taking hold either. But he's never really let go of this idea that Russia massively interfered in the election with the hack of the DNC and Podesta emails and these $100,000 in Facebook ads from a private Russian clickbait farm. So in your article, you go through some of this. Could you take us through exactly why you believe Mueller has a flimsy case for the Russian side, the thing that he seemed most certain of?
Well, the flimsiness and the disingenuousness of Mueller's case was just really exposed over the past few weeks when it comes to what Mueller calls the second part of Russia's sweeping and systemic interference. So he says that Russia's interference occurred principally through two operations. And the first one he identifies is a social media campaign by this firm, the IRA, the Internet Research Agency, to sow discord. That's what Mueller says was the aim was. And, and he says that this is part of a Russian active measures campaign and all this stuff. And the suggestion that he strongly leaves us with, starting with his initial indictment of this Russian firm in February 2018, through his report with language like that this was a part of a Russian government interference operation, was that this troll farm was acting on behalf of the Russian government. I mean, that's been the widespread assumption. That's the characterization widely repeated across media. I mean, but if you look at Mueller's report closely, and this is what I point out in the article I did, Mueller never actually says that this troll farm was working with the Russian government or was acting on the Russian government's behalf. He asserts in one section that this troll farm was a part of a Russian interference operation, which was carried out by the Russian government, because he also accuses the Russian government of hacking the emails. But then when it gets down to actually describing the troll farm's actions, he never says that it works with the Russian government. And that is because it's a private Russian clickbait firm putting out, by the way, juvenile ads that mostly have nothing to do with the election. So even if this were like coming right from the Kremlin, the notion that this was an election interference operation is a joke, because this was juvenile clickbait ads. And Bob Perry, if I remember right, was pointing out what a farce this was from the beginning, about how all these ads were mostly unrelated to the election, and most of them, by the way, aired after the election. So it's disingenuous in itself to claim that this was an election interference effort when it's clickbait trash on social media. It's even more disingenuous now that Robert Mueller, and this is the latest news from the past few weeks, has had to admit in court that the Russian government had nothing to do with that clickbait. So that right there, if that is the first of two principal operations, Mueller says, of Russian interference, but Mueller has to acknowledge it has nothing to do with the Russian government, then the obvious question is, what else is Mueller being disingenuous about? And how strong of a case does he have for a sweeping and systematic Russian interference campaign if the first one has just collapsed? And then you look at the details for the second aspect, which is the hacking and leaking of Democratic Party emails. And that's where it's a bit more complicated. There's what I try to point out in my piece is a few things. One, when he gets down to describing the actual operation where he wants us to believe Russian GRU officers stole the emails, he throws in a qualified word. He says, during the sessions, GRU officers, quote, appear to have stolen thousands of emails, which to me raises a red flag, because if in his initial indictment he said the Russian government officers stole the emails, why then, nearly a year later in his report, is he now saying they appear to have stolen the emails? That says to me that is a legalistic way to cover up for the fact that he actually doesn't know for sure that Russian government officers stole the emails. And there are many other things. His timeline when it comes to Guccifer 2.0, this alleged Russian intelligence cutout who supplied the emails to WikiLeaks, is really off base. According to Mueller's narrative, Assange would have announced that he had Assange would have had to have announced the pending publication of these stolen Democratic Party emails, which he did on June 12th, before he communicated with his Russian government source and got the documents from his Russian government source, because Mueller contends that Assange got this stuff from the Russian government and that the cutout they used was Guccifer 2.0. So that just doesn't make sense on its face that Assange would do that, which brings us to another glaring hole, which is that Mueller didn't speak to Assange, which is just a very puzzling investigative decision. If you're investigating a theft of emails, you want to speak to the person who received that theft and who published it. And there are many more examples like that call into question Mueller's case here. But I think that's a good place to start.
Elizabeth, before I bring you in, I wanted to ask Aaron one more question about the. He says that there were texts, and he gives the file names in the report, that these were the texts that Guccifer 2.0 and DC Leaks sent to Assange. And then he mentions there were intermediaries that transferred the files. I mean, which one is it? And why would Assange even know? If this were a Russian intelligence operation, would be, I guess, on a need-to-know basis. They wouldn't told Assange. So he's accusing him of lying in the report, that Assange is lying about it not being Russia. How would Assange even have known that? He could have gotten, if he got it from an intermediary in particular.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. But my focus here is whether or not Mueller has proved that Assange even got the emails from a Russian government source. And by the way, I'm sorry, I missed out the biggest part. Mueller explicitly acknowledges that he has no idea how Assange got the emails. So what he did in his indictment of the GRU officers for allegedly stealing the emails in July 2018, and later on in his report, he suggests, he doesn't outright say actually, but he suggests strongly, and he wants us to believe that Assange got the emails when Guccifer 2.0 transferred them to him, because Mueller includes in his timeline that Guccifer 2.0 transferred a large file to WikiLeaks in July. And then soon after that, WikiLeaks published the emails. So Mueller wants us to think, without outright stating, because he can't outright state it because he doesn't actually have proof that it's true, that Guccifer 2.0 transferred the emails to Assange. But then in the report, Mueller drops something new. He says the office cannot rule out that the stolen emails were transferred to WikiLeaks physically in the summer of 2016, which tells us that Mueller has no idea how those emails made their way to WikiLeaks, which is all the more interesting because otherwise Mueller claims to have this really invasive window into Russian intelligence. So invasive that he can tell us, what searches they made and what keystrokes they did, but yet he, all of a sudden, when it gets to telling us how they made their way to WikiLeaks, all of a sudden he has no clue. And that is I think a huge red flag when it comes to, trusting Mueller in his trying to prove to us that he knows how this email theft was committed.
Elizabeth.
Absolutely. No, I thought it was a fascinating point you made multiple times in your article, that there's this profound lack of curiosity from Mueller when it comes to Assange and WikiLeaks and actually investigating that part of this major issue. So I don't want to ask you to speculate too much, but I wonder if you have an opinion on whether that profound lack of curiosity when it comes to Assange and WikiLeaks, and also with, getting the access to the DNC servers directly rather than just allowing, the CrowdStrike's redacted draft to suffice. Do you think that was more about protecting the narrative of Russiagate, or was that just some sort of oversight, if you would like to comment?
Yeah, well, look, okay, so take how Mueller approached the collusion angle, for example, because when it comes to that, there is a profound commitment to protecting the FBI's narrative. And it's not surprising. Mueller is the former director of the FBI. This is what he comes from. So the idea that Mueller would have come in and done this independent review and just gone for the facts is really unlikely. And his work product shows that, because on all these key things, he is not applying sufficient scrutiny to the FBI's decisions. And he's sort of lending credence to the FBI's narrative by simply ignoring countervailing facts. So, I mentioned Konstantin Kilimnik before. Kilimnik is, the FBI says that Kilimnik has ties to Russian intelligence. And the reason why he's important is because he's a business associate of Paul Manafort. And for a while, it was a big part of the conspiracy theory that because Manafort allegedly shared polling data with Kilimnik, and because Kilimnik allegedly has ties to the GRU, that meant that Manafort shared this polling data with Kilimnik. Kilimnik then passed that to the Russian government, and the Russian government used that for their sophisticated targeting of American states. And that's why Donald Trump won, because these Russian social media ads were so brilliant and so sophisticated that they swayed American voters using possibly the polling data that Manafort passed on to Kilimnik, right? So Mueller mentions that Kilimnik has ties to Russian intelligence, which on its face, like, what does that mean? He has ties to the GRU. Does that mean he's an agent? Does that mean he just spoke to somebody who's a GRU agent? What does it mean? It's like, it's a vague term to imply something sinister without having to actually make a direct claim on Mueller's part. So Mueller includes that in his report, and he then lists all these reasons about why it's quite plausible that Kilimnik has GRU ties. He omits the fact that Kilimnik was literally a State Department informant. And, that was known, some details of that were known, but we recently learned more details from John Solomon in The Hill. And I believe Consortium News covered this too, but he omits the fact completely that, like, Kilimnik was providing valuable intelligence to the State Department when Kilimnik was working in Ukraine with Manafort, where, by the way, Kilimnik was helping Manafort pursue, trying to push Ukraine away from Russia, which is another aspect that is completely ignored because, there's a need here. There's an imperative here to prove a conspiracy theory. And those inconvenient facts don't jive with that. So that's just one example of Mueller being disingenuous to justify the collusion speculation, when really the collusion speculation was baseless to begin with. And so is it fair to speculate that Mueller took the exact same approach when it comes to the Russian government interference operation? Yeah. And look at the fact that he tried to strongly suggest that the Russian government interference operation included a troll farm that he knew full well had nothing to do with the Russian government. So I think the idea that Mueller embellished the facts, Mueller took certain things, ignored others, the fact he didn't interview Julian Assange, I think it's all fair to conclude that Mueller was not interested in finding out the actual truth.
Absolutely.
Well,
go ahead, Joe.
Yeah, the indictment against the GRU officers will never be proven one way or the other. These guys will never show up in a U.S. court. And I think that makes it a political document, that indictment. And Mueller had to understand, given the way the media was behaving, that they would run with this and never use the word alleged to talk about his indictment, but that it's a fact. You'll read it repeatedly in the biggest newspapers in the country that Russia stole these emails without any it ever going into a courtroom, and it won't. So that brings me to the role of the media in this. You've been really good on this, Aaron. Mueller had to understand what kind of media he was working with, and he can get this into the papers as if it's a proven fact and never have to prove it in court.
Yeah, the level of stenography in Russiagate and the absence of critical thinking, is like nothing we've seen since the Iraq War. And again, Bob Perry, literally, if you go back and read his work at the beginning, because again, I came along kind of late. Like I came along to this issue in like the summer of 2017, but Bob Perry was on this from the beginning. And he repeatedly was pointing out just how farcical and flawed all these stories were. So we all know that, and we all know how awful MSNBC was and how unhinged they were with their insane conspiracy theories. I mean, getting to the point where you had people like Rachel Maddow wondering if Putin was giving Trump orders, and that becoming normalized. That became a normalized facet of our political and media culture. And you can't find enough examples of unhinged, crazy rhetoric becoming mainstream. And one day, somebody, maybe I'll do it, we'll put together a good documentary just of all the craziness that we went through. But what I'm particularly concerned about in this context, speaking to a leftist progressive audience, is the fact that websites like Consortium News, the Gray Zone, for a while when I was there, although I'm not there anymore, at the Real News, we stood out because we were some of the few ones that were not going along with it. But I think a big problem happened where Russiagate became synonymous with being anti-Trump. And so any questioning of Russiagate was then, on the surface taken by some progressives at prominent outlets like The Intercept and Democracy Now! And of course at the Young Turks and some of my colleagues at The Nation. Questioning Russiagate, I think for some people became seen as somehow helping Trump. When of course in reality, I mean, putting aside the fact that we have a duty as journalists to follow the facts, politically, I can't think of a bigger gift to Trump than diverting his resistance into a baseless conspiracy theory, taking attention off of his actual policies, and then once it all collapses, handing him the gift of being vindicated. I mean, I think, I came at this from two angles. As a journalist, just trying to follow in the footsteps of people like Bob Perry, following the facts, even no matter the consequences. And politically, as a progressive, thinking this is a nightmare. I mean, it's distracting from Trump's actual policies. It's venerating intelligence communities. It's putting our faith in Robert Mueller, whose record includes not lying, but coming to Congress and peddling the lies about Iraq having WMDs when he was director of the FBI, rounding up Muslim immigrants after 9/11 and detaining them and subjecting them to harsh conditions. Turning anti-Trump resistance into a form of sort of militarist jingoism because it encouraged confrontation and militarism towards Russia, and then conspiracy theory thinking, and paranoia. So this was a disaster for progressive causes, but I think unfortunately there was a lack of thinking on the part of some of our colleagues in progressive media in seeing that, and unfortunately partly because Russiagate incentivized people to play along with it. If you challenged it, you were deemed as, a Putin apologist or a Trump supporter. And if you peddled it, though, if you drank the Kool-Aid and went along with it, then you had benefits. You could get published in the New York Times and the Washington Post, and you could appear on MSNBC and CNN. And so it was an incentivized racket for too many people. And unfortunately, too many people, including some of our colleagues in progressive media, got sucked in.
Well, that answers the next question I was going to ask you, which is how much does this set us back and set the country back in terms of the ability to beat Trump? As you say, the real resistance against Trump, rather than this, kind of fake propaganda narrative pushed to the breaking point in a way that just, as you say, hands him a victory. Do you think that this has almost destroyed the chance of any Democrat, whether progressive or neoliberal, to actually go against Trump, or is it not quite that terrible of an event?
Well, I mean, I hope it's not terrible. I guess we'll see, right? And we'll guess. I think partly that depends on how long Democrats and their partisans and media continue to double down on this. How much more time they want to waste? How much more of how much deeper do they want to dig their grave? When it comes to Russiagate, it's the problem is they're so delusional that they're behaving like people in denial, refusing to let go of it. And we're seeing this now with this belief that Robert Mueller in his testimony will somehow, that's going to be the thing that's going to save everything. So it's I'm also interested to see also how much damage it did to progressive voices, because you saw, I mean, Russiagate served so many nefarious purposes. One of its uses was to denigrate and demean progressive voices. So that's why you had Bernie Sanders having to explain away and disavow the fact that allegedly Russian trolls boosted his candidacy, and Jill Stein as well. They were tainted, and Jill Stein was even investigated by the Senate Intelligence Committee for having ties to the Russian government and all that. So there was an obvious effort here to, in the process of making Russophobic conspiracy theory thinking sort of synonymous with being against Trump. There also was an attempt to sort of, attack elements of the left that challenge militarism and challenge the national security state as being sort of apologists for Trump and for Putin. And we'll see, how much of an impact that might have had on progressive forces and their ability to organize, and whether Democrats who loathe Bernie Sanders will try to somehow use Russia in some weird way to attack him. If he's not hard enough, if he's not like hawkish enough on Russia, whether they'll try to use that to undermine him. That to me is an interesting political question that I think will play out, as 2020 gets closer.
Just a sorry saga about the state of American politics, this entire Russiagate fiasco. Aaron, I want to thank you very much for joining us today on the first edition of CN Live, and I hope to see you back again soon.
Thank you, Joe. It's great to be here, and I just I appreciate the opportunity. Thank you.
Thank you, Aaron. And with that, we end the first edition, first premiere episode of Consortium News Live, CN Live. I want to thank Elizabeth, our host, and all the guests we had today. And we'll see you next Friday at 2 p.m. Eastern Time for the second edition of CN Live.
Get out your notebook. There's more.